Joshua's lips unconsciously hardened as he answered, "My dear fellow, I would not have a secret from my wife. Why, it would be the beginning of a new order of things between us. We have no secrets from each other. If we ever have, then you may begin to look out for something odd between us. Still," said Gerald, "at the risk of unwelcome interference, I say again be warned in time." "The gipsy's very words," said Joshua. "You and she seemed quite of one accord. Tell me, old man, is this a put-up thing? You told me of the gipsy camp. Did you arrange it all with Her Majesty?" This was said with an air of bantering earnestness. Gerald assured him that he only heard of the camp that morning, but he made fun of every answer of his friend, and in the process of this raillery the time passed and they entered the cottage. Mary was sitting at the piano, but not playing. The dim twilight had waked some very tender feelings in her breast, and her eyes were full of gentle tears. When the men came in she stole over to her husband's side and kissed him. Joshua struck a tragic attitude. "Mary," he said in a deep voice, "before you approach me, listen to the words of fate. The stars have spoken, and the doom is sealed." "What is it, dear? Tell me the fortune, but do not frighten me." "Not at all, my dear. But there is a truth which it is well that you should know. Nay, it is necessary so that all your arrangements can be made beforehand, and everything be decently done and in order." "Go on, dear. I am listening." "Mary Considine, your effigy may yet be seen at Madame Tussaud's. The juris imprudent stars have announced their fell tidings that this hand is red with blood. Your blood." "Mary! Mary! My God!" He sprang forward, but too late to catch her as she fell fainting on the floor. "I told you," said Gerald. "You don't know them as well as I do." After a little while Mary recovered from her swoon, but only to fall into strong hysterics in which she laughed and wept and raved and cried, "Keep him from me, Joshua, my husband!" and many other words of entreaty and of fear. Joshua Considine was in a state of mind bordering on agony, and when at last Mary became calm he knelt by her and kissed her feet and hands and hair, and called her all the sweet names and said all the tender things his lips could frame. All that night he sat by her bedside and held her hand. Far through the night and up to the early morning she kept waking from sleep and crying out as if in fear, till she was comforted by the consciousness that her husband was watching beside her. Breakfast was late the next morning, but during it Joshua received a telegram which required him to drive over to Withering, nearly 20 miles. He was loath to go, but Mary would not hear of his remaining, and so before noon he drove off in his dog-cart alone. When he was gone Mary retired to her room. She did not appear at lunch, but when afternoon tea was served on the lawn under the great weeping willow, she came to join her guest. She was looking quite recovered from her illness of the evening before. After some casual remarks she said to Gerald, "Of course it was very silly about last night, but I could not help feeling frightened. Indeed, I would feel so still if I let myself think of it. But after all these people may only imagine things, and I have got a test that can hardly fail to show that the prediction is false. If indeed it be false," she added sadly. "What is your plan?" asked Gerald. "I shall go myself to the gipsy camp and have my fortune told by the Queen." "Capital. May I go with you?" "Oh no! That would spoil it. She might know you and guess at me, and suit her utterance accordingly. I shall go alone this afternoon." When the afternoon was gone Mary Considine took her way to the gipsy encampment. Gerald went with her as far as the near edge of the common and returned alone. Half an hour had hardly elapsed when Mary entered the drawing-room, where he lay on a sofa reading. She was ghastly pale, and was in a state of extreme excitement. Hardly had she passed over the threshold when she collapsed and sank moaning on the carpet. Gerald rushed to aid her, but by a great effort she controlled herself and motioned him to be silent. He waited, and his ready attention to her wish seemed to be her best help, for in a few minutes she had somewhat recovered, and was able to tell him what had passed. "When I got to the camp," she said, "there did not seem to be a soul about. I went into the centre and stood there. Suddenly a tall woman stood beside me. Something told me I was wanted she said. I held out my hand and laid a piece of silver on it. She took from her neck a small golden trinket and laid it there also, and then, seizing the two, threw them into the stream that ran by. Then she took my hand in hers and spoke. "Naught but blood in this guilty place," and turned away. I caught hold of her and asked her to tell me more. After some hesitation, she said, "Alas, alas! I see you lying at your husband's feet, and his hands are red with blood." Gerald did not feel at all at ease, and tried to laugh it off. "Surely," he said, "this woman has a craze about murder." "Do not laugh," said Mary. "I cannot bear it." And then, as if with a sudden impulse, she left the room. Not long after, Joshua returned, bright and cheery, and as hungry as a hunter after his long drive. His presence cheered his wife, who seemed much brighter, but she did not mention the episode of the visit to the gipsy camp, so Gerald did not mention it either. As if by tacit consent, the subject was not alluded to during the evening, but there was a strange, settled look on Mary's face, which Gerald could not but observe. In the morning Joshua came down to breakfast later than usual. Mary had been up and about the house from an early hour, but as the time drew on she seemed to get a little nervous, and now and again threw around an anxious look. Gerald could not help noticing that none of those at breakfast could get on satisfactorily with their food. It was not altogether that the chops were tough, but that the knives were all so blunt. Being a guest, he, of course, made no sign, but presently saw Joshua draw his thumb across the edge of his knife in an unconscious sort of way. At the action Mary turned pale and almost fainted. After breakfast they all went out on the lawn. Mary was making up a bouquet and said to her husband, "Get me a few of the tea roses, dear." Joshua pulled down a cluster from the front of the house. The stem bent, but was too tough to break. He put his hand in his pocket to get his knife, but in vain. "Lend me your knife, Gerald," he said, but Gerald had not got one, so he went into the breakfast room and took one from the table. He came out feeling its edge and grumbling, "What on earth has happened to all the knives? The edges seem all ground off." Mary turned away hurriedly and entered the house. Joshua tried to sever the stalk with the blunt knife as country cooks sever the necks of fowl, as schoolboys cut twine. With a little effort he finished the task. The cluster of roses grew thick, so he determined to gather a great bunch. He could not find a single sharp knife in the sideboard where the cutlery was kept, so he called Mary, and when she came told her the state of things. She looked so agitated and so miserable that he could not help knowing the truth, and, as if astounded and hurt, asked her, "Do you mean to say that you have done it?" She broke in, "Oh, Joshua, I was so afraid." He paused, and a set, white look came over his face. "Mary," said he, "is this all the trust you have in me? I would not have believed it." "Oh, Joshua, Joshua!" she cried entreatingly, "forgive me," and wept bitterly. Joshua thought a moment and then said, "I see how it is. We shall better end this or we shall all go mad." He ran into the drawing-room. "Where are you going?" almost screamed Mary. Gerald saw what he meant, that he would not be tied to blunt instruments by the force of a superstition, and was not surprised when he saw him come out through the French window, bearing in his hand a large Gurkha knife, which usually lay on the centre table, and which his brother had sent him from northern India. It was one of those great hunting knives which worked such havoc at close quarters with the enemies of the loyal Gurkhas during the mutiny, of great weight, but so evenly balanced in the hand as to seem light, and with an edge like a razor. With one of these knives a Gurkha can cut a sheep in two. When Mary saw him come out of the room with the weapon in his hand, she screamed in an agony of fright, and the hysterics of last night were promptly renewed. Joshua ran toward her, and, seeing her falling, threw down the knife and tried to catch her. However, he was just a second too late, and the two men cried out in horror simultaneously as they saw her fall upon the naked blade. When Gerald rushed over, he found that in falling her left hand had struck the blade, which lay partly upwards on the grass. Some of the small veins were cut through, and the blood gushed freely from the wound. As he was tying it up, he pointed out to Joshua that the wedding ring was severed by the steel. They carried her fainting to the house. When, after a while, she came out, with her arm in a sling, she was peaceful in her mind, and happy. she said to her husband. "The gipsy was wonderfully near the truth. Too near for the real thing ever to occur now, dear." Joshua bent over and kissed the wounded hand.